No, it was useful, but I think it's something I want to follow up with. Good evening. Last time I stood up here, I didn't have sheets of paper. I had Jesse Barry standing right here telling me what to say. But now I have paper. And the first thing I have to do is tell you who I am. I'm Steve Kelling. I'm the Director of Information Science here at the Lab of Ornithology. Today we're going to be having a talk that's really special for the projects at the Lab of Ornithology, those particularly that I'm involved with. But I have to inform you all that we're going to be live streaming this tonight, so people everywhere have the opportunity to hear this presentation. The next thing I have to tell you is that the next seminar will be here on November 2nd, which is a Monday night at 7:30. And it'll be Garrett Vinn, who's going to be talking about the lab's new book called The Living Bird. And I don't know if you've seen that or had an opportunity to see that yet, but it's a very special book. So I encourage you all to come out for that. Also, another place dear to my heart in New York State, the Cayuga Bird Club this Saturday will be going up to Furd's Bog and another bog that's called Sabatis Bog in the Adirondacks. Look for gray jays, boreal species. That's a great place to see blackback, three-toed woodpeckers. They'll stop for lunch and dinner. You should bring snacks, and it might snow. All birders are welcome, and you can contact Carl Steckler. Carl, you want to stand up? And Carl will tell you how to get there. They're going to leave 7 a.m. from the lab parking lot. Okay. So tonight I want to introduce two people. One's an old friend and one's a new friend that's going to talk about a project about conservation of bird populations in Central Valley of California. You're first, Brian? Brian Sullivan, who is one of the project managers for eBird, lives in Monterey, California, but works remotely here at the lab. He's been our link with Mark Reynolds, who is the lead science officer for the Migratory Bird Initiative for the Nature Conservancy in California. And I know I screwed that up, but I did pretty well. Pretty close. And they're going to talk about a project called BirdReturns, which links citizen science with NASA Earth imagery, uses concepts and big data analysis techniques to solve a problem about how to keep fields flooded, rice fields flooded for shorebirds. Brian?
Thanks. All right, thanks, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Everybody watching online, including my 3-year-old at home. Hi, Ella. I'm really excited to be here tonight. It was about 10 years ago that I came into this room and gave a presentation about my vision for eBird. They were hiring a project leader position, and I was lucky enough to get that job along with Chris Wood. And it's been a pretty crazy, fun decade of work here at the lab. And I'm really lucky to be involved with everybody in this building. eBird is touched by everyone in this building, and the success of eBird is not only because of the team that works very closely on the project, but also because of the fact that it's housed here at the lab, and everybody here should take pride in what we're about to talk about today. It's been a really fun project to work on and continues to be a great challenge moving forward. So today I'm going to talk about the big data side of this story. How do we get the data that we need to deliver conservation action on the ground? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of eBird, how we engage the community, all the way down to the ways that we create data, scientific data, that can be used in conservation. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mark to show basically our highest profile exemplar of conservation action happening on the ground with eBird data. So our hypothesis all along with eBird is that data collected by birders could be used for science and conservation. And it's taken a long time to sort of figure out whether or not that's true. When I started giving talks about eBird 10 years ago, I would say that with certainty, and boy, I sure hoped it was true. And now 10 years later, it's really beginning to become a reality. And the life cycle of eBird, if you think about sort of what we do with the project, we engage a broad global community of birders to collect big data. We have a never-ending focus on data quality. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We have a central tenet of open data access, so everything that we collect is completely open for research conservation. We have a shop that's tied to eBird that helps analyze the data and provide data sets that can be used for conservation. And ultimately, the goal is bringing it all around is when people use these data for conservation action, that's when eBird's a real success story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about community engagement. And this is the side that 10 years ago, Chris Wood and I and Marshall Iliff and others thought a lot about. How do we get people to actually use this project, these tools that we have? And this slide here is basically a from outer space view of eBird's world as it looks today. These are 3 million locations where people around the world have submitted checklists of birds. And as we zoom in, you can see that there's a lot of detail here. If we zoom in on North America and then here on the Northeast, every one of these little yellow dots represents a location where people are collecting information about birds and submitting it to eBird. So we've been pretty successful in the last 10 years within the community engagement side. We've collected 250 million observations. 5.5 million people have used eBird. We've collected data on just about every species that's existing in the world right now from every country around the world. And over the last 10 years, our growth curve has been fairly exponential. So we've had some success here, and one of the key pieces to the success was building tools for birders. When we first got here, eBird sort of was, the technology of the internet was a little bit nascent. Everybody was on dial-up connections. The concept of eBird was that you should submit your data because it's good for birds and it's going to be great for science and conservation. But there wasn't much for birders in terms of getting something back for all that time and energy. At that time, it took a long time to just enter your data online. And then when you did, it sort of went into this black box and you couldn't get anything back from the project. So Chris and I and Marshall and others came up with these ideas for tools that would engage the birding community and make eBird a little bit more sticky, as we say. So when people get invested in it, they begin to get things out of it that help them do what they like to do, which is go birding, keep track of what they see, things like that. So one of the key pieces that we put in right away was this My eBird page, which allows you to keep track of all your bird observations in one place. We spent a lot of time streamlining the data entry process. So we knew that it was a hurdle for people to enter data online. So we made this as easy as possible. And today we're really focused on shifting this process to the mobile world. So we have an iOS app now for data entry that's available in 6 or 7 languages. We're working feverishly on an Android version of this app. And this is really opening up eBird to new audiences around the world, that it's really their only connection to the internet is through mobile devices now. We have a developing collaboration with the Macaulay Library that's really focused on rich media. So it might even be tomorrow that we launch this functionality to the public for the first time, where you can upload photos and sounds directly to your eBird checklists, and then they become embedded in the Macaulay Library archive that's been in existence for 100 years. So that's not only creating an amazing scientific research collection, but it's giving birders, again, tools that they find useful. There's communities around the world whose only engagement is through the camera lens with birds. They don't think about using binoculars like we do traditionally to birdwatch. They're using cameras. So tools like this will allow us to engage different sort of emerging communities of birders around the world. So that's sort of the data input side. On the output side, we have these millions and millions of bird observations. How do we organize them in a way that a birder would find interesting? I had a question just before the talk. How do I find recent observations of a species? I can't do it. Well, these tools that we develop on the Explore data page are supposed to make that easier. So this is an example of one tool called the Region Explorer. You can type in any region here, state, county, and it gives you this dashboard overview of all the activity that's happening in a region. So this is just a visualization for Tompkins County, and you can see all the species that have been reported, who's seeing them. It's a great way to sort of just quickly visualize, all these millions of records that are coming in. We have tools that allow birders to understand status and distribution of birds, such as bar charts. These tools are really simple. They take the raw data and they plot it out over time, and you can see when birds are occurring in the region. So I showed up here on Saturday, third week of October, and you can see I'm a little bit too late for veeries, which are at the top of the list here. Most of the veeries are gone. I would have had to come in September to catch the veery migration. But tools like this are really useful for traveling birders to understand when to visit a region, a target species, things like that. We have a next generation version of what are traditionally called range maps. And these start at the global scale, so you can type in any species in the world and see their global range. And as you zoom in, you actually interact with real data points. So these blue and red markers on the map represent observations for wood thrush around here. The red ones are right around the lab. And as you interact with these points, you can see how many were seen, who saw it. You can get to their checklist directly. It's a great way to sort of interact and, again, dig into these millions of records. It's not lost on us that birders like rare birds, so we give them a series of tools to explore what rarities are being reported in a region. You can go look at this stuff on the eBird website, or you can even sign up for alerts that send emails hourly to your account if you're that crazy as a birder. One of the equations that we found to be true pretty early on in eBird was that birders plus competitive spirit equals more data. And it sounds kind of trivial, but every tool that we've built in eBird was centered around the idea of driving more data into the system. And this one, called the Top 100, tends to drive birders a little bit crazy. But in driving them crazy and getting them into the field, they're submitting lots and lots of complete checklists of birds that we can then use for scientific modeling and conservation. So as you can see, if you look on the left column there in the middle left, it says complete checklist, and at the top of that list is Jay McGowan. He submitted 1,100 complete checklists of birds just in Tompkins County this year. And this is happening in counties all over the US and countries all over the world. So when birders get engaged in these kinds of competitive things, it can really drive a lot of data into the system. So this year we launched really what is the world's biggest competitive bird competition. It sort of pits countries against countries instead of birders against birders. And in this case, we launched this project called the Global Big Day. This year it was on May 9th. And what we found was that the idea of sort of countries banding together to try to find as many species as they can in a single day really resonated in a lot of places around the world in ways that we haven't been able to connect with these groups in the past. So a good example of Global Big Day success was in Brazil this year. Brazilians really enjoyed taking control over this competition, and they pitted themselves against Ecuador and Peru in particular. And they were, on social media, this was a really hot topic. Who's going to see the most birds? And it drove a lot of data into the system from places where we didn't have data before. I think Chris Wood said somebody told him that they thought the Global Big Day was as fun as watching the World Cup. So we thought that was pretty good to have a comment like that come from a Brazilian. But when you gather all these data, you really have to worry about data quality. We spend a lot of our time as eBird project leaders with Steve and others at the lab just really trying to constantly evolve our data quality process, because we know that observers have variable skills. There's all sorts of variation in the way people go birding. We have to account for all of this in a modeling process. So we basically, we want the cat bird, but we don't want the bird dog. And to do that, we've developed this tiered data quality system. That's okay, that was a loon. We have automated data quality filters that are spread out around the world, and these you can think of as geographic regions in which people can submit data without it being flagged for review, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We have this quickly expanding network of regional editors that help vet these flagged records when they do get, when they're kicked into the system as unusual. And those experts correspond with birders in a region that are coming up, and that sort of expert beginner communication shouldn't be understated, or because it's really important that happens. And most recently, we've begun modeling differences in observers' abilities to detect birds. And when we can understand that piece and put it into the modeling process, it's really going to improve our ability to model birds accurately. So evolving data quality and the data quality filters. When we started eBird, our goal was to have one data quality filter per state in the US. And you can see the state of California is quite large. Soon we realized that wasn't gonna work, so we broke it in half. And then the next step was to break even counties within California down to smaller geographic regions. And right now, this is the process we're in with eBird. This is the stage of our data quality filters piece, where we've got a county like Riverside, California now has 8 filter regions. And you can, the idea of these filters is to flag records of birds that aren't supposed to occur in these biogeographic regions. So if you're in Riverside County and report a northern cardinal, it's going to get flagged. But there's a lot more subtlety to it. It also flags birds that are early or late in their migration. It flags high counts. All of these things get looked at by our regional editors. So the most exciting piece of this evolving data quality process recently has been the ability to understand differences in observers. And Steve Kelling and others just published a paper in PLOS One on this notion that we can understand a person's ability to detect birds by looking at this metric that's called a species accumulation curve. And what you see on the screen here are 3 different individuals' species accumulation curves. What a species accumulation curve is, it's pretty simple. It's the number of birds you see per unit time, so hours spent in the field. Eventually, you're going to tail off on the number of different species you can detect. And very experienced birders tend to detect more species more quickly than beginning birders. And there's also differences in the makeup of species that they can detect. But the key thing is that once we understand these differences, we can start to build those into our modeling processes and improve the performance of those models. And a key outcome of this paper was not only the modeling component, but also that over time, we can, for the first time, actually measure how much better a person gets as they submit more data to a project like eBird. So these two graphs right here show that as you submit more checklists, your species accumulation curve actually gets steeper. So you're learning, you're getting to be a better birder. And it's a really significant outcome of this paper that our observers are actually improving over time through engagement with projects like eBird. So we've got all this data, but it's really important to not let it sit here on servers where no one can get to it. So we have to think about data access, and we developed early on the notion that we would always make data freely available for research conservation use, but we had to figure out sort of which communities out there wanted eBird data, then we had to develop the appropriate data sets for them. So right now we have these 4 different data sets that package eBird data, all these millions of observations in different ways. And this list of data sets, I'm not going to get too into the weeds on these, but they're basically very basic views of the data at the top down to very marked up views of the data that have all sorts of covariates that are designed for more rigorous scientific analysis. But so far we've had 40,000 downloads of the eBird data set. And those data come through either direct access at eBird or partner organizations like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is a all taxa data clearinghouse, and they also serve eBird data up in a very simple form. So people can come to eBird and get the 3 more rigorous data sets, or they can go to GBIF and get the more simple view of the data. The point is there's a lot of data downloads happening with these data right now. So on the eBird side of things, we can understand a little bit about how people are, what this community of people downloading the data looks like, because we have a little bit of an access gateway on the data. We ask you who you are, if you have an organization, what your project is, things like that, so we can get metrics like this that tell us a little bit about how the data are being used. And you can see that a huge proportion of the data use right now, almost 50%, is from the education, the academic and student community. Today we're going to focus on the other side of this pie chart, the 29% NGOs and governmental agencies, as well as the general side. This is where people are accessing eBird data and using it more for conservation. So another key component of this, what we call the eBird enterprise, is the science component. We need to be able to understand all the benefits and drawbacks of the kinds of data that we collect. And we need to be able to model those data, use them in different types of analyses. So these data right now are being used by people outside the lab as well as inside the lab. And really, the eBird data, they provide this foundation of information on species occurrence, abundance, and distribution. These things are basically the building blocks of just about every conservation process that's happening out there right now. You need to know where the animal lives and in what numbers and when in order to conserve it properly. So at a very basic level, eBird data get used in publications like Birds of the Sierra Nevada, journals of bird record like North American Birds, lots of technical literature, white papers, gray literature, things like that. But they're also being used in more higher level scientific analysis. And this paper is an example of a data use of eBird where they explored the evolution of this radiation of Australian honeyeaters over time. In this case, a grad student here in the the lab used eBird data to understand the shift in Carolina chickadee and black-capped chickadee's hybrid zone. So this was really amazing to me on a number of levels. One, who in here can identify a hybrid chickadee? Not me. They're really hard. And also, this shift that they detected was actually 11 kilometers over 10 years. The hybrid zone's shifting north, and they used a combination of genetic analysis to look at these captive birds to look for this hybridization, but they also verified it using eBird. I just thought it was pretty amazing that they could detect such a small range shift in a rather obscure hybrid taxon. So inside the lab, we have a group upstairs where we have these really incredible scientists that are looking at eBird and starting to try to model the way birds move on the landscape. And this example is some work that Frank Lesort did looking at the trajectories and speeds of migration of birds. And this example is using white-throated needletail, which is one of my favorite birds in the world. It's this huge sort of beautiful swift that nests in Asia, winters mainly in Australia. And you can see on this range map, we don't have a ton of data for this species. But you can see some points in the Himalayas and some across Central Asia and then a lot from Australia. And what Frank has been able to do is look at the centroids for each day of a species range and then plot that on a map, and he can see over time this trajectory of migration. What he shows for white-throated needletails is that they have this big looped migration that goes out over the Pacific and then comes up in spring on the west side of this trajectory. And he also can understand how fast these things are going. So the difference between these little plates, these little horizontal bars on the trajectory, are one-day intervals. So these, the centroid of the range is moving very quickly during migration. Then when they get to Australia, they all get stacked up because they're down there for a few months before they shoot back north. And the neat thing about this type of analysis is that once we can understand how it works for one species, we can look at a lot of species. And this map shows the migration trajectories or centroids of a species range for a suite of North American migrant birds that winter in Central and South America. And you can see the dates running across the bottom. So this is summer. They're all up in the northern parts of North America. And now it's fall migration. They all start to move back down. And this is really significant for a number of reasons, because we're seeing all of these species doing different things, but we can also see where these trajectories concentrate and highlight areas of conservation importance on a map for a suite of species. So this is the first time we've been able to see this for a large number of birds at once. And it's pretty fun to look at. And for the birders in the room, you're probably all going, what's that one doing this? What's that one? That's what we do every time we look at this. So that centroid modeling approach is really, really neat and it's telling us a lot about these dynamics of migration. Another group here at the lab, led by Daniel Fink, has developed this next generation distribution modeling process called STEM. And without getting too technical about it, it takes your eBird data and associates your observations of birds with a lot of different variables, landscape characteristics, all these things that may influence bird distribution. And then we create models that allow us to look at bird populations, the whole population, move across the landscape. And this is really for the first time, the most significant thing to be able to watch an entire population of birds move through its entire life cycle, from breeding in the boreal forest, like these magnolia warblers do, to wintering in these core areas in Central America. And this is a map that shows the abundance of magnolia warblers. So you can see in the summertime, they're mainly, the high numbers are off in the eastern part of the boreal forest. They migrate through the eastern U.S., trans-Gulf migrant. They come into the Yucatan and Belize and Guatemala, and they winter there in big numbers. So the predictive modeling process here is allowing us to do a lot in terms of understanding specifics of bird migration, but it's also enabling a lot of conservation, because under this really pretty visualization is tons and tons of data. There's 1 million data points here on the landscape that we're making predictions for magnolia warbler every week for every year. So we're understanding a lot. And when we can do that, this is a different visualization that I just wanted to show that just came hot off the press today. This one is actually like Frank's centroids animation. This is a whole suite of migrant species that breed in the boreal forest in eastern North America and winter in Central America. And the thing that we were looking for here was trying to identify regions of conservation importance for this particular group of birds. And as you can see, when they migrate south, they're piling into the Gulf Coast states, and then they winter again in that Belize, Guatemala region in really high numbers. So the idea of conservation is to understand the most important places on the landscape, and this kind of information allows us to get to it. I'm going to see if I can get this to play. All right. So when we have this information, we can look at it and look at these visualizations from afar, but underneath is a lot of information that's very, very fine scale. So as we zoom in on New York, right here on Ithaca, we're looking at a visualization now of ovenbird during the breeding season. As you can see, as we zoom in, we're predicting where ovenbirds are occurring in very high resolution. And this ability is really transformational because it allows us to be very precise about where this bird lives and where it doesn't. And this is what helped Mark and the TNC in California be so effective with their project BirdReturns. So I'm going to start this conservation piece just by saying that there's a lot of conservation action happening now with eBird data. In a recent study here at the lab, we found more than 150 tangible conservation actions happening as a result of eBird data. And those range from research and monitoring, conservation planning, to different types of actions like habitat management, species management, things like that. And Mark's really going to focus his exemplar tonight on this habitat management component here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit more in detail about this project BirdReturns. And Mark, thanks a lot for being a great partner for us, for the lab, and for eBird. This is one of our flagship success stories. So I'm really, really proud and glad that Mark's here to be able to tell it to you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. Brian's conveyed some of the innovations and excitement around this revolution that you're all participating in, which is citizen science and bird watching being able to contribute to big data that has applications in science and in conservation. And I can only say, as a conservation scientist with the Nature Conservancy, how exciting it has been to collaborate with the lab and with the whole eBird team and Brian and Steve on taking some of this rich data and applying it to some very acute conservation challenges we have, not only in California, but also in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in California and the ways in which big data analytics can contribute to conservation on the ground and solving some of our biggest conservation challenges, one of them being migration. We all know that migration is a challenge because the birds don't stay in one place. They move around. It's a challenge in scale and in scope. And so the example that I'm going to be talking repeatedly about tonight is this bird. This is the dunlin. It's a medium-sized, rather nondescript shorebird, but it's a good example of the kinds of species that really have a lot of trouble with the changes that we're visiting on the planet as we're altering wetlands globally. So dunlin, of course, like many shorebirds in this hemisphere, breed in the Arctic, and then they come down the Pacific Flyway with millions of their fellows and stop over in places and look for food to put on resources to help them with the rest of this perilous journey that they're taking that's thousands of miles. And eventually they end up in California. And that's a great thing. This is a wondrous cycle that we're all able to participate in and experience of animal migration, except that there are problems all along the way. And it's not just for dunlin. The Pacific Flyway is traveled by about 65 species of water birds. So from Aleutian Canada geese, white-fronted geese, small ducks, dabbling ducks, waders, other shorebirds, all use this aerial superhighway to get from their breeding areas to wintering areas. The problem was when they get to California, California is innovative in so many things, and we're also, unfortunately, a leader in global habitat destruction. So in the Central Valley, we've lost about 95% of our wetland habitats. And so for birds, this is what the Central Valley looked like In pre-settlement times, in the 1800s, there was a rich tapestry of about 4 million acres of integrated wetland systems. And since that time, we've lost about 95% of them. And with that, we've seen some pretty precipitous declines in water birds, particularly waterfowl and shorebirds. But they haven't winked out entirely. And part of it is because when they experience historically this kind of landscape, now this is a bird's eye view of the Central Valley of California. And it's still a mosaic, and there's a lot of opportunity for them to find habitat in this agricultural landscape that we've created in California. It just has to be managed correctly. And so part of what our vision for this landscape is a way in which our small but very important anchor sites of refuges work in concert with the agricultural landscape and the urban landscape to protect and preserve migration in perpetuity. So from the agricultural point of view, here's what this habitat looks like. 14 million acres of the Central Valley. In the far northern part of the Central Valley here in blue, you're seeing our rice growing region. So in California, there are about 500,000 acres of rice lands, and mostly in the Sacramento Valley. Moving south, you see it changing to the teal colors of various field crops. And then in the southern part, in the San Joaquin and the Tulare valleys, you're seeing the growing landscape that's dominated by that red. That's nut crops. And then also the purple, which is vines for table grapes and also for vineyards. So this landscape has a lot of potential. But we're also finding it to be a landscape that's vastly less resilient than the pre-existing wetland landscape. So building resilience into this landscape in terms of the kinds of crops that are grown and how they're managed is really what we need to do in order to secure migration basically for future generations. And one way we're thinking about this at the Nature Conservancy is we've done a pretty good job at identifying places that are important enough to be protected forever. And those are the places that we and our partners buy and restore, and eventually some of them become part of our protected areas, refuges, and federal and state lands. And so that's the anchor site. But what happens in the rest of this landscape, you may want that to change from year to year. You may want that to be responsive to climate change, to drought, and to various other factors. And so we think about trying to mimic the dynamics of bird migration and how we do our conservation. So this is the fundamental premise of dynamic conservation. So in one year, we may need this kind of habitat strewn all throughout the San Joaquin and the Sacramento valleys. This could be an example like the years we've just been experiencing with this dire drought, where we need habitat well distributed throughout the Central Valley. And that's been the impetus for this work that we've been doing the last couple of years. To hopefully an El Nino year this year, very wet. There may be abundant water available and wetland-like conditions throughout this landscape. And from a conservation point of view, we may need to provide less additional habitat and distribute it in certain ways that are responsive to what's happening out there. So the vision for dynamic conservation is that we can couple precision science, such as the kinds of models that Brian talked about, with new conservation tools, which are really much more fluid and less about protecting something in perpetuity and more about working with the working parts of the landscape, the farmers and the agriculturalists, and getting them to do beneficial things for wildlife, but maybe just at the right place and the right time. If we can do that, we can build momentum behind changes in policy that would be necessary to really scale this to the whole flyway scale. So that's the vision of dynamic conservation. Now, where does this precision science come from? Well, fortunately for birds, as you all know, they're very well studied. We know more about birds than we do of almost any other taxa. And we typically at the Nature Conservancy work with research partnerships and try and figure out where and when the animals and plants that we're trying to protect need habitat. And traditionally, this has meant working with long-term demographic studies or radiotelemetry. These are great data sets, but they usually give us really precise information about only a handful of species. And again, on the Pacific Flyway, we're interested in protecting all 65 species of our water birds, keeping those common birds common, keeping those ecosystem services part of our agroecosystems. And there really wasn't a source of information to develop the precision science around this until this. And so one more really wonderful visualization of eBird data. This is for the northern pintail. Northern pintail is a duck that's very important to us in California. They're a whole Arctic duck, but in North America, their wintering populations, about 60% of the population winters in the Central Valley of California. And this is a duck that's declined precipitously since the 1950s and still hasn't reached its recovery targets. So it's a species that we're very interested in. And we've long been looking for a way to really understand where and when it needs habitat, not just in California, but across the flyway. And when I first saw these visualizations from the eBird data from the lab, I thought, this is it. This is how we're going to be able to pinpoint those places where we can work with landowners and make a difference. So a few years ago, we started a partnership with the lab here and started taking some of this data and downscaling it to California, to our study area in the Central Valley. And already, just even at this level, it starts to reveal patterns that we've never seen before. That gives us an opportunity to think about the timing and the placement of additional conservation. So this is a pintail loop running throughout the summer. We'll take it again through fall and just look at a couple of the places that are important here. Sorry about that. So has pintail come into California? They're one of the fastest flying ducks and one of the earliest arrivers in California. And we can already see the rice lands and the refuge system in the Sacramento Valley popping in that early part of the fall and then filtering into the rest of the state. And so this information is conservation actionable for us. Even though we had that sense, we still wanted to verify it. And so to reiterate some of the points Brian made about data quality, we took this initial data set of modeling outputs from eBird and put that against a really rich data set of telemetry locations for northern pintail, shown here in purple. And fortunately, we see amazing concordance. This is data that's very painstaking to get. Long-term studies of radio-marked pintail, researchers driving up and down the Central Valley in fixed-wing aircraft too. And you can see it really maps on well to the model predictions, which gives us the confidence that this information is conservation actionable. So we can take those data and, again, look at where and when birds most need habitat, something we've never really been able to do before with this level of sophistication. So here I'm showing a map of the Central Valley. The agricultural lands are in brown, and that small but really important network of protected areas is in green here. And we can put the pintail distribution for a specific time slice on top of that and see how much of that protected area's landscape is actually benefiting the pintail and what needs to happen in order for them to have habitat in the agricultural lands. Now we can take that for a variety of species now and look at what their needs are week by week. And so this is another bird that we very much care about in California and elsewhere. This is the long-billed curlew, North America's largest shorebird, a species that's declining, and it depends on an agricultural matrix as well as pasture land for its habitat. And we can see that it's, at this particular time period, does not very well map onto the protected areas landscape. So this is a species for which private lands conservation is really essential. Okay, so we can take all of these data and start to ask some of these really important conservation questions regarding when and where do we work, but we also wanted to put it together with data about the habitat. Where and when is the habitat available? What condition is it in? And so to do that, we started thinking about water availability and surface water. Where is it on the landscape? When is it available? And when is it correlated with the predictions for the birds? And we started a project with Point Blue Conservation Science, one of our conservation partners in California. And they had developed a methodology for looking at Landsat satellite imagery for the presence of surface water, an algorithmic approach to all of this Landsat data. This is the world's oldest Earth-observing satellite system from the 1970s that takes imagery of the same location on the planet every 14 days. And so it's a huge data set. And we've now mined this back to the year 2000 and are able to make these kinds of maps of where and when surface water is available in this very dry, heavily altered landscape of the Central Valley. So now this gives us the ability to look at places that we have high predictions for birds and low predictions for water and go in there and try and make a difference and make better habitat for the birds. So this is really the scientific underpinning of BirdReturns, this habitat restoration and enhancement project I'll be referring to for the rest of the talk. And this is an example of the least sandpiper, where we have the predicted occurrences here in orange and the water availability underneath in blue. And it gives us the ability to look at high to medium predicted occurrences for that bird in places where it could have better habitat. And that gives us the power of precisely locating when and where we need to go talk with those farmers and try and align their practices with the needs of the birds. So we piloted this in California rice growing region because rice is a flood managed crop, and there's already a well known scientific basis for rice serving as a proxy to wetlands because it's flood managed. The issues with rice are it's only beneficial at certain points in the year. So this is the annual cycle of rice in the top, from the field preparation and seeding of the fields all the way through when the rice is growing and when it's harvested. And at certain times of year, there's water on the landscape and it's not covered up with a crop. And those are the times of year when shorebirds can use that habitat. There are also times of year when that water is pulled down and those fields are dry, but there's still water available, and those fields could be kept wet a little bit longer. So looking at the shorebird potential needs gives us the ability to precisely target activities those farmers could do to specific weeks of the year, particularly in the early fall and in the early spring. And so armed with this information, we went into Grange halls and county libraries all over the Central Valley and met with farmers and talked with them about whether they would be interested in working with the Nature Conservancy and having us help them create habitat during specific times of the year. And we were really surprised that farmers were pretty excited about this, especially because we gave them the option of submitting a competitive bid for the cost that that they would incur in providing that habitat. So this is our auction period. We have auctions that we run in September through October in 2-week increments, and in February and March. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this works. We do this in a format that's called a reverse auction. So most of you know what a forward auction is. It's when you have a precious item that you sell to the highest bidder. So the little graphic in here of the guy at the auctioneer, that's from the sale of Edvard Munch's the Scream, which at the time was the most expensive painting ever sold at auction. And so the Scream, there's only one of it, you all want it, you all bid against each other, the price goes up. In a reverse auction, we are the buyer and we want something from each of you. And because of that, you're all competing to give me what I want at the least price. So it's just as it's named, it's a reverse auction, and the goal is the lowest price. But we still wanted the highest quality, so we weren't trying to not pay the farmers what that habitat was worth, but we were trying to get the most habitat for our very scarce conservation resources. This was a big experiment, so even with this bolstering of our strategy with this rich data and analysis behind it, we still had a lot of uncertainty. Would this work? If we provided habitat these times of year, would birds respond? Would the habitat be any good? Could we get enough farmers to participate that we could investigate this competitive auction tool? And would the auction actually be better than if we just paid everybody the same price? And so those were the 3 hypotheses that we had when we first did this in the spring of 2014. We were really excited to have a group of willing farmers that wanted to work with us. We had 53 bids submitted for an initial effort. It was a pretty great success. It covered about 40 individual rice farms. We ended up selecting about 80% of the bids that were submitted. And we were asking farmers, again, to provide habitat just for shorebirds, 2 to 4 inches of water depth. There's a lot of habitat programs out there, and our wildlife refuges are mostly focused on habitat for waterfowl. So we wanted to focus on shorebirds because they mostly are not getting their needs addressed by other conservation programs. We had about 10,000 acres in our initial offering of this program, and again, it ran through February through March. This is an inset here of the Sacramento Valley and also of the water availability shown in blue here, and our 3 main areas in which we had farms participating. It was really good geographic coverage. It included small farms, big farms, industrial farms, family farms. So for a relatively small sample, we were really pleased with the diversity of participation. So what were our results? Again, about 11,000 acres were in the program. We contracted with about 80% of the bids. The auction proved to be really pretty cost effective. It cost about 25% less than if we had paid everybody the same price. In our structuring of the auction, we gave people some feedback on their initial bids and gave them an opportunity to come down. That also drove the price down about an additional 15%. And relative to the cost of protection, we do a lot of protection at the Nature Conservancy, and we've actually purchased conservation easements on rice farms for birds. This cost about 1%, less than 1% of the per acre cost of buying this property either in fee or putting a conservation easement on it. So pretty cost effective. So what about the birds? Well, we had to go fairly deep in the science here to really verify that this was creating good bird habitat. So we designed a sampling program to have really trained professional avian scientists go visit points on the landscape and count the birds that were in these fields. We also worked with our farming community to do some counts on fields that weren't in our program because we were interested in the comparison. So we have some treatment fields and then a small number of control fields to compare with. So this is some of our points, and we do 200-meter point counts where we count all the birds that we are able to see in that radius on those fields. This is my colleague Greg Gillette. He's a senior scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and he's been leading our monitoring program. Here's Greg entering some data from one of our BirdReturns fields on an iPad, and it goes directly up into the cloud, and we can view it on our servers later that day. So this has been a project that's spurred a lot of innovation for how we just do basic field work, and it's been really terrific that way because we're able to get results fairly rapidly. So this is the bird responses from spring of 2014. In the upper left, species richness, there are about over twice as many species in our treatment fields as in the control fields. Not too surprising, most of the treatment fields had more water on them than the control fields. Shorebird densities were about 30 times higher on average in the treatment fields than on the control fields. And these densities, particularly later in the year, are higher than anything that's been reported in the literature for California rice lands. So by putting habitat at the right place at the right time, we were really benefiting more birds at higher densities. Below are just some summary stats on waders. These were non-target birds, but yet we're using our fields as well, and waterfowl as well. The hero of spring of 2014 was the dunlin. We had amazing responses of dunlins. In fact, one of our field techs observed a flock of 20,000 dunlin on one of our fields, which is estimated to be about 20% of the entire Central Valley dunlin population for that time period on one field. So emboldened with this information and this success of having farmers participate in the program, we've extended the program. And we have made it basically a year-round program, and we're now starting our third year of doing this kind of work. Expanding the program has meant a couple of things for us. One, more participation means that the auction can function better. We can accept more bids, but we can also reject more bids. We have more acres bid, we can be more selective. We can pick higher quality habitat. Throughout, we've also been trying to make the most of scarce conservation dollars and of precious water in the drought. So we've been trying to use this as a model program of adaptation and efficiency, even as we've been trying to extend it. So to date, we've created about 35,000 acres of temporary wetland habitat. This is habitat that would not have been there absent this effort. We now have a growing community of about 150 farmers. Not all of them have been in every auction cycle. A lot of new people coming in. Word is getting out about this as being something that people can do in a way that doesn't undercut their bottom line and that they want to participate in. Many of our longtime participants are now really interested in the birds and are really looking forward to having them come back the next time that they're in the auction. We have over 50 species that are benefiting from this, and we have now a mountain of bird observational data from our treatment fields and our control fields. So what's next for this? Well, I think that this is an example of the power of citizen science, big data, and conservation coming together around some of the big conservation issues we have globally. This is just one of many examples where I think we're developing new approaches and new tools to really match the dynamics of the natural world with better and more efficient conservation. In this case, we're trying to put habitat when and where the birds need it most and trying to achieve greater results at scale. We're also trying to optimize conservation investments and throughout this lay strong scientific foundations for adaptive management. We've had the benefit and misfortune of running this program during the greatest drought in California history. And we were fully expecting that we might go open for business and have no farmers show up because of the risk they would be taking. That was not the case, and we've again proved that this can be one way that we adapt to drought conditions and the new normal of life in a changing California. So I want to close on this image here. If I can get this to run. So this murmuration of thousands of dunlins is flying over a field that wouldn't have been there, absent the contribution that you all make as bird watchers through eBird to citizen science, to big data, and to the ability that conservation groups can have to try and make this landscape a little less harsh for these animals. So Karen Vellis, who was one of our field techs, took this last spring and sent this to all of us on the team. And for those of us that don't get to get out in the field every day, this was really a great thing to see. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and I think Brian and I would be happy to take some questions if we have some time.
Have the farmers, do they get any other benefit other than just the monetary benefit? I mean, are the birds perhaps eating something that's detrimental to their crop or contributing something that's beneficial to their crop? Has anybody looked at that?
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and repeat your question since we're streaming. So the question was, do the farmers get any other benefit besides the monetary benefit? Do the birds provide any benefit? And we believe they do. There are a number of studies that have looked at the effects of concentrations of birds on rice fields in helping the farmers to decompose the rice stubble, which is really why they flood their fields in the middle of the winter, is to break down that stubble so they can get ready for planting in the next season. A lot of these birds are also eating a lot of invertebrates, and some of those undoubtedly are agricultural pests. That's less well studied, but the effect on decomposition has been studied experimentally, so yes.
Sort of to piggyback on the question, do you see any farmers that don't successfully bid to you guys still after the bidding session want to preserve their fields as well and ask for assistance in how to do so?
So the question is if any of the farmers who submit a bid to our program who aren't successful or are maybe rejected, if they pursue additional avenues for conservation. And many of them do. We're not the only game in town. There are other programs that they can go to if they're interested in receiving some compensation for habitat benefit. It's not something that we are able to track. We mostly track what's happening within our own program. How do we, so many hands, how do we do this? Okay,
Mari.
yeah, remember you had your hand up, we'll get to everybody.
How secure is the funding for your program, and where does it fit into the general finances of the Nature Conservancy?
Well, the funding for this program has come from our generous donors, so this has been a privately funded program, and we are very interested in a vision for the sustainability of programs like this. And so what we're exploring now is how to use these private dollars to actually influence how public money is allocated for this kind of bird conservation so we can drive larger impact. It's something that we're always interested in doing with private money, is trying to extend the impact. And for this program, it's something that state and federal agencies are very interested in, so we're very hopeful that there's a long-term future for this. Okay, Miyoko, ahead.
Yeah, we have a question from the online audience wanting to know how the drought in California has affected migration for shorebirds and maybe even how it's affected bird returns.
So the question is regarding how the drought in California has affected migration for shorebirds, and what was the second part?
Whether it's affected the bird returns program or any behaviors of the farmers.
Yeah. And whether it's affected the bird returns program and the farmers. So the drought we're experiencing in California is unprecedented, and it has effects on communities and on farms and agriculture and on everyone in California, and also our wildlife. So this has been no joke, and it's been a real challenge to work in this environment and to try and further all of our goals for a prosperous California. The ways that we know that it's been affecting the farming community, we've had about 25% of the rice lands fallowed. I think this year it's going to be about 35%. And a lot of those fallow lands don't provide this kind of habitat once they're taken out of rice farming. So that's sort of a double whammy for the economy of the valley as well as for the opportunity to do good things for wildlife. In terms of how the drought is expressing itself, the water availability analysis I pointed to that we're doing with Point Blue, we're finding that over the period of droughts from 2000 to the last year, we're able to see the signature of those droughts in that water availability signature. And it's most profound, oddly enough, at the times of year that are most important to shorebird migration. The fall and the spring are the times of year where we have the less water available because of the drought than we have in non-drought years. In terms of how it's affecting the birds, that's a big challenge because we're only able to really understand what's happening with the birds when they're on our fields, and we may be attracting more birds because there's less habitat available. That's certainly one hypothesis we're investigating. We've also been working with Point Blue on radio telemetry of birds and looking at the movements of dunlin and of dowitcher relative to habitat availability and drought. That analysis is in process. But these are big questions, and every year is going to be different in California. This year, we'll see whether it's another dry one or whether there's more habitat available.
Have you experimented with any other habitats other than rice fields and had any outcomes with that as well?
The question is, have we experimented with any other habitats besides rice fields? We are just starting to take on some work that's outside of the rice growing region. We have some work that we're doing exploring providing beneficial habitat for cranes in corn. The Nature Conservancy owns a very large corn farm in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta called Staten Island, not this Staten Island. And so we're very interested in the long-term future of sandhill cranes in these agroecosystems, and we have some fields that are outside of our Staten Island Preserve that are being managed for cranes that are cornfields. So we're aggressively looking for new crop types to try this out in. Sure, yeah.
How do you manage the seeming contradiction between California's very pressing conservational issues, for example, water and bird conservation? It seems like they're somewhat
So the question is, how do we manage the contradiction and controversy between water and birds in California? Did I get that right? Well, I think that this is a new reality for conservation, and the drought in California is very serious, but it's analogous to conservation issues all over the planet, where we have trade-offs and we have people making a living on the landscape, and those needs need to be factored into how we do our conservation. I think we're all aware that in this age of humans dominating the earth, everything's going to be about trade-offs. It's no longer as simple as it once was to identify something important for nature and draw a circle around it and protect it. These are dynamic systems, and trade-offs is really what it's all about. So in this case, we're trying to balance the needs of Californians, other uses of water with the needs for birds. By being more precise about when and where we use less water, and we're able to be more efficient and hopefully benefit wildlife along the way. Yeah.
Two somewhat related questions. The first is, how confident are you in general that the water quality is favorable for the birds in terms of pesticide residues, fertilizers, and so forth? And secondly, do the farmers get anything in terms of added nutrients in terms of bird droppings from those thousands of
So two questions. One is regarding water quality. Are there water quality issues with bird returns and bird habitat in the California Central Valley? And the second relates to whether the birds are providing any other ecosystem benefits in terms of nitrogen and fertilizer through their presence on the fields. So water quality issues are present throughout the Central Valley. In the Sacramento Valley, I think most people are aware of now, a couple decades ago, there was a set of water quality issues at the Kesterson Wildlife Refuge in California. A lot of birds were killed. That was selenium concentration, and that was in the San Joaquin Valley, which has agricultural drain water issues which aren't present in the Sacramento Valley. So we don't have those kinds of issues. The Sacramento Valley, in addition to supporting rice farming, also is the drinking water basin for the city of Sacramento. And so they have a lot of water quality regulations in terms of the kinds of pesticides and herbicides that are used in the rice ecosystems. So at least at that level, this is also an area inhabited and used for drinking water. So we feel somewhat confident about water quality issues that way. Chris Elphick, who's a leading shorebird scientist and in many ways the godfather of agroecosystem shorebird ecology, has studied shorebirds in California for a couple of decades, and he's assured us that there are no known examples of massive die-off of shorebirds from any sort of herbicide or pesticide issues. It's something we're concerned about and aware of, and that we want to study more deeply in the future. But for right now, I think we're just trying to meet the basic habitat needs.
Well, thanks. It's been a great talk, Mark and Brian. We'll be around a little bit afterwards if you have other questions, but I think it's a good time to thank the
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, it was.